All right, we are on to Rule 13, which is interpret the passage in harmony with its context. So I hope that these rules have at least illustrated one thing. Context is the most important rule of interpretation. Nearly every flaw that people find in the Bible, put in quotes, flaw they find, every error in quotes that they find, can come from the fact, or typically come from the fact that they didn't read the context. You can pull a verse out of the Bible and say, you know what, this is screwed up. There's no way that could be true. And yes, if that one verse were the only verse in the Bible, it would be really messed up. But it's not. You've got the whole book, the whole Bible to consider before you can actually draw a conclusion about a single verse. So, to ensure that you understand the context of a verse, there are 4 questions you can ask yourself while you're reading it. First is, how does this passage relate to the material surrounding it? This refers largely to the material immediately surrounding it. So how does this verse relate to this chapter, or this paragraph even? How does this verse relate to the book as a whole? And then you can even pull back and say, how does this verse relate to the entire Bible? So that is very important. How does it relate to the material surrounding it? And I think we've already covered the other 2, or the next 2. How does it relate to the rest of the book? How does it relate to the whole Bible? So that's what you do. You read a verse, say this doesn't make sense, read the verse before it, the verse after it. If it still doesn't make sense, try the paragraph before and after. If that doesn't work, try the chapters before, the chapter of, and the chapter after. Try the whole book. And after that, you have to kind of zoom out and go, what does it mean in the context of the whole Bible? And if you still can't figure it out, then you can, find your pastor or something to talk to. Someone who's got more tools to help them research the meaning of the verse, that kind of thing. And the 4th part is, how does it relate to the culture and background in which it was written? That requires a little practice and requires some good tools. I can get you a book before we're done here. It's in the other room. That is Cultural Backgrounds Bible. And it covers all those weird little things, like in Ruth when they're trading sandals to seal deals. They don't sign contracts back then, they traded sandals. You read that the first time, you think, what in the world are they doing? When you understand the historical background, that's just how deals were done, suddenly it makes sense. They're shaking on it. They're sealing a deal of some kind. Are we clear with that? Everybody good? Simple rule, very profound, very important. If this is the only rule you remember out of all of these rules, this one is important. Context is important. All right, Rule 14. When an inanimate object is used to describe a living being, the statement may be considered figurative. So if you remember, we just finished Rule, it was 12, I think, talking about interpreting the Bible literally. Now we're getting into some rules that tell about when you can interpret something figuratively. So if you consider John 6:35, Jesus describes himself as the bread of life. John 8:12, he describes himself as the light of the world. And 10:7, he describes himself as the door for his sheep. Now, is God literally bread, a light, or a door? This should be an easy question. No. So why are they using these things? Why is Jesus referred to as a door? Because he's the way that people enter heaven. He's the way people are saved. He is the door to rest. Why is he called a light? Because he's a light to the world. Why is he called bread? Or specifically the bread of life.
Bread feeds people.
Bread feeds their bodies. Jesus feeds the spirit. So yeah, that's exactly it. So these things are not intended to be literally applied to Jesus, what they're intended to do is describe some aspect of his nature or character. As a corollary rule, when life and action are attributed to an inanimate object, the statement may be considered figurative. In Micah 6:8, Micah pleads with the mountains to hear his prophecy. Were the mountains listening? No. Why was he pleading to the mountains then? That's right, you have to read the verse. He's pleading with the mountains as a way of saying, all of Israel, please listen to me. He's not speaking to the mountains, he's speaking to the nation, saying everyone should hear me, even as far as the mountains. And I don't mean people in the mountains, I mean it should be, everyone should hear me to the point that even the mountains are listening. So he's using a hyperbole to say, hey everybody, I've got something important to say. It's directly from God, hot off the press. Pay attention. All right, we're good with that. Again, it's a fairly simple rule. Rule 15. And this is another one like 14. When an expression is out of character with the thing being described, the statement may be considered figurative. All right? So this can be done in reference to a person's characters. For instance, Paul described the Judaizers as dogs in Philippians 3:2, telling the Christians in that area to beware of the dogs, the Judaizers. So were the Judaizers a pack of rabid dogs? No. Does anybody remember what the Judaizers were?
Yeah.
Wild warriors.
Excuse me?
Wild warriors.
Yeah.
In the early church, when Paul started going to people other than Jews with the gospel, the Jewish believers started trying to change the new believers into doing Jewish tradition when they weren't Jews. Need to do Jewish tradition.
Yeah. So what he's saying is these people are not someone you should listen to. They're filthy dogs. Keep in mind back then, dogs were a necessary evil. Basically, they were mangy and gross and mean. They wandered the street and ate carrion. Yeah, they were feral dogs. So people let them in the city because they cleaned up dead stuff. They weren't there because people wanted them there. They weren't pets. So calling someone a dog was actually a pretty serious insult. Jesus himself called Herod a fox in Luke 13:32. Herod was not literally a fox. He just had certain qualities that resembled a fox. He was very conniving. Let's see. 2 Corinthians 6:19 refers to the eyes of the Lord. I believe it says the eyes of the Lord search. Something like the eyes of the Lord search here and there for hearts or something like that. But it's not referring literally to God's eyes. What is it referring to? If you want, you can pull up the verse. That might help. 2 Corinthians 16:9. $16.9. 2 Corinthians 16:9. Yep, chapter 16. I must have written down the verse wrong. Wonder, what's the verse? It's supposed to be 2 Corinthians, but I bet it's 2 Chronicles. But I typed in the verse wrong. So I seem to recall it was an Old Testament verse, not a New Testament. Try 2 Chronicles.
First, second, Chronicles.
No, Old Testament.
Somewhere in the middle.
First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. In the books of history.
Second from what?
16:9. Right there.
Okay, go ahead and read it for us.
For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to show himself strong for those whose hearts are completely his. You have no foolish in this matter, for him that from now on you will have wars.
Right. So when it's referring to the eyes of the Lord, what is it talking about? Is God literally looking at them, like up in the, if you look up in the sky, you can see his eyes looking down? No, what is it talking about?
Him watching over you?
Not quite. It's a big word. It's omniscience. It is all-knowing nature. Or you could say it's his omnipotence, which is his all-powerful nature. But not his literal eyes. So, who can guess what will help you determine the meaning of these figurative statements?
Context.
Exactly, context. Once you get context, the whole Bible makes a lot of sense. So just a couple of things to make note. Context should help you determine the meaning at the time. And because even a lot of times if you don't know the definition of the word, if you see how it's used, you can kind of figure it out. And also interpret the passage literally if at all possible. If you really can't figure out the word, a biblical dictionary or the concordances you guys have with the dictionaries in the back will help you figure it out. We're good with that rule? Okay, rule 16. And this is all we're going to do for tonight. 4 rules, I think, is plenty for homework and stuff. I don't want to be giving you guys too much. I need the actual school and things to deal with. All right. Consider only the principal parts and figures of a parable when drawing conclusions. So what does this mean? It means that when you're reading a parable, such as the parable of the soil that we talked about in church on Sunday, you shouldn't try and assign meaning to every little detail. Right? I mean, it talked about, what were the main figures of that parable? Does everybody remember?
The sower, is that what you said?
Parable of the soil. It's also called the parable of the sower.
The sower and the grain.
It's more about the soil than the sower.
Oh. Yeah, where the seeds fell.
So everybody remembers there's a sower, and he's throwing out seeds. The seeds land in either good soil, rocky soil, shallow soil, or good soil. There's some good soil. I forget.
Yeah.
So what was the 4th soil that I'm forgetting?
But there was only 3.
There was thorns.
Thorns. That's it. Thorns. All right. So, what parts of the parable should we consider when drawing our conclusions? Should we consider that the sower was out walking and drawing, most likely using his right hand and pulling out seeds and throwing it in a specific arc? Is that important?
We talked about that in the past.
I don't remember talking about this.
Well, it depends on where those seeds land, how he throws it. So.
Should we consider what clothes the sower was wearing? Is that important?
No.
Well, it could be if he was wearing like really heavy stuff.
Is it important when it comes to the actual meaning of the parable? No, not really. Should we consider what kind of birds ate the seeds off the path? Or what kind of thorns choked out?
No.
Well, it sounds like somebody we get on a rabbit trail with, though, for sure.
Exactly. That's exactly what you need to avoid. You don't consider those parts. You consider the main point. And Jesus, fortunately, interpreted that parable for us and knew exactly what the main point was. He spends almost no time talking about the sower. He spends most of his time talking about the dirt and how well the seeds grow from the dirt. The rest is a minor detail. And if we spend a lot of time considering those things, we're going to get off on rabbit trails. This was actually a really difficult rule for the Catholic Church to follow before the Protestant Reformation. And you might think, oh, it can't have been that bad. It was bad. I have some examples here. The Catholics believed that a parable would have 4 levels of meaning. There was the literal meaning, as in, so if they said Jerusalem in a parable, they referred to the city of Jerusalem. There's the moral meaning. So if you refer to Jerusalem, it could mean the human soul. There's the spiritual meaning, which means if you refer to Jerusalem, you could be talking about the church body. There's the heavenly meaning, which means if you refer to Jerusalem, you could be talking about heaven, the city of heavenly peace. All right? Each element of a parable was assigned meanings for each of those 4 levels. So consider the meaning of the Good Samaritan. All right? If you guys remember that, the man going down from Jericho, beat up by robbers, left for dead. A priest comes by and ignores him, and a Levite comes by and ignores him. And then the Samaritan, who are supposed to be kind of like these unliked people, comes by and helps him, takes him to an inn, fixes up his wounds, leaves money with the innkeeper, promises to pay him anything additional it costs. So here is some of the things they came up with. The man going down to Jericho is Adam, as in Adam and Eve. Jerusalem, from which he was going, was paradise. So Adam left the Garden of Eden, which was paradise because of sin. Jericho, where he was going to, was the world. So basically sin forced him out of Jerusalem, paradise, into the world. His wounds that he received from his beating represent sin. The priest that ignored him was the law. The Levite that ignored him was the prophets. Jesus is the Good Samaritan. The beast that carries the man's body is Jesus Christ. The inn is the church. The 2 denarii that the Samaritan paid the innkeeper are the knowledge of God. The innkeeper represents the angels. The return of the Good Samaritan is the second coming of Christ. And that is just one level. That's just the moral meaning of the parable. It doesn't include the other 3 levels.
Kind of missing the whole point.
Kind of missing the point. They were so busy writing in their interpretations on these different levels of meaning. I mean, this was literally 1,000 years of work to come up with these different levels of meaning. Because they didn't come up with them all at once. It was this priest said, oh, there's the literal meaning, here's what it is. Another priest came along and said, yeah, there's the literal meaning, but then there's also the moral meaning, and here's what that all means. They kept building on each other, adding more and more meaning, assigning meaning to things that didn't matter. Even getting down to the point that the oil that he applied to the wounds had a representation, where the thieves that beat him up had some meaning to them. It became quite arduous just to read a parable. This is one of the first things that the Protestant Reformation got rid of. They said, kind of somewhat famously, it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. So they let Jesus interpret the parable and figured he knew what he was saying, so there wasn't any point going any further. And the parables he didn't explain, they kind of took a similar approach that you don't need to assign meaning to everything, just get the gist of it and learn your lesson and move on with your life. Which is very true to the way Jesus interpreted parables. He always offered very simple explanations. The whole reason for using a parable was to make it relatable. So creating a parable so you can hide secret meanings isn't in it. It's kind of odd. In fact, the Catholic Church believed that the secret meanings were not intended by the authors. They accidentally put them in there under the divine leading of the Holy Spirit. Which, of course, leads to the fallacy that if you're trying to encode a secret meaning in text, it is itself an act of writing text. Therefore, there is no hidden meaning. You can't accidentally put meaning into something. It's a logical tongue twister, but it eventually, it kind of undermined itself eventually. So, when you are interpreting a parable, follow this very simple procedure. Determine the purpose of the parable. Make sure you explain the different parts of the parable in accordance with the main design. Use only the parable's principal parts when explaining the lesson. That's pretty simple, right? 3 steps. Basically, it comes down to what is the general meaning. Okay, are we all good with that? Questions? Comments?
I think so.
All right, that gets us through Rule 16. So in 2 weeks, when we get back together, hopefully you guys can have those done in the homework sheets. We can go through them. Hopefully, there are only 24 rules around Rule. We just finished Rule 16, so 2 more weeks of this, and we can move on to correlation, which correlation is a fun one. You get to learn to use all kinds of different tools.
Sounds like.
Anything else? Well, thanks for coming, and